On an early autumn night in 2013, the Umatilla forest was thick with cold mist and the pungent scent of pine resin. Wind hissed through the treetops, sweeping damp earth up onto the porch of an old wooden house at the forest's edge. A man stepped down the creaking steps, a flashlight in one hand and a battered toolbox in the other, his dusty boots striking firmly on the wet gravel. "David L." Parker paused, glancing back at his wife, standing in the doorway, arms wrapped tightly around herself. He gave a slight nod, his voice low and curt as if to cut off any question. "Just a few minutes." He turned and walked straight into the darkness of the forest. The sound of insects faded, the wind swallowed everything, and silence took over. That night, he never came back. The night sky over the Pacific Northwest was black as ink, heavy clouds drifting above the Umatilla forest, thick with the smell of impending rain. The damp earth breathed up into the cold air, mingling with pine sap and rotting leaves, a familiar weight to anyone who'd lived here long enough. On the gravel yard below, the Parker cabin sat in the faint yellow glow spilling from its windows. On the porch, Janet Parker stood hunched, clutching a wool shawl tight around her shoulders. She watched her husband bend to pick up his flashlight, strap a battered toolbox to his hip, then slowly descend the steps. David L. Parker strode purposefully across the yard, his shadow stretching long across the stones. He stopped at the gate that opened onto the trail through the woods, glancing up at the sky. The trees swayed, their black branches sweeping through the moonlight. He turned back, catching his wife's worried gaze. He didn't say more, just gave a faint nod and let out a curt line. "Just a few minutes." Janet pressed her lips together, trying to hold her composure as he slipped into the dense stand of pines. The sound of his boots on dead leaves faded within yards. She went back inside, brewed a pot of tea, and waited. An hour passed. Janet stepped back out onto the porch, the flashlight hanging by the barn still dark, the yard eerily quiet. David's pickup truck was still parked by the door, keys left in the ignition. The cold wind blew in from the forest, carrying the cry of an owl and the low hiss of wind through the broken fence. She called his name softly. No reply. Another 30 minutes. Janet pulled on her coat, stepped down into the yard. Behind her, the porch light guttered out, and the darkness of the woods stood like a solid wall before her. She called louder now, her voice trembling. "David, only the wind." No light, no answer, no footsteps. Close to midnight, Janet finally went back inside, picked up the old rotary phone. Her voice was hoarse, broken as it cut through the silence. My husband's missing. He went into the woods, and he hasn't come back." Outside, the forest swallowed every sound, keeping it secret as it always had. By the time the first patrol car turned down the dirt road to the Parker ranch, dawn was breaking, and a pale fog had swallowed the fields. Red and blue lights washed over the pine branches, cutting across the broken fence and the dew-soaked yard. Janet stood on the porch, her eyes red, hands clutching the buttons of her sweater, as though afraid they might come undone. A young officer stepped out of his cruiser, offered a reassuring greeting, then listened as Janet recounted everything. Her words halting, her hands trembling when she described the last time she'd seen David. He jotted notes quickly, though his gaze kept drifting to the dark line of forest at the edge of the property. When he bent to check the pickup truck, he nodded at the sight of the keys and papers still on the driver's seat. By 8 o'clock, more patrol cars began arriving, followed by rescue SUVs, forestry trucks, and the pickups of local volunteers. They set up a wooden table in the yard as a command post and unrolled a detailed topographical map of the Umatilla forest. Red strings were pinned across the map, marking sectors of the search grid. When the first Oregon State Police helicopter lifted off, Janet stood silently on the porch, watching it skim the treetops, the sound of its blades roaring down like a storm. A veteran ranger named Carlson laid a gentle hand on her shoulder and assured her there was no evidence yet of harm, that David might have simply slipped somewhere or wandered farther than planned. Janet only nodded. But inside she knew. Her husband wasn't careless. Not ever. By noon, the forest echoed with barking dogs and distant whistles. More than 30 men moved in disciplined lines, sweeping deeper into the woods in neat grids, eyes scanning roots, brush, and crevices. The dogs bayed at every unfamiliar scent, but they only found traces of deer, foxes, or the abandoned campsites of hunters. One team scoured the creek to the north, where the trail broke along the cliff. Another pushed through the dense old-growth forest, where light barely pierced the canopy. The sheriff himself stood at the yard table, binoculars trained on the teams, radio crackling at his hip with constant check-ins. But there was nothing. Silence, no tracks, no answer to their calls. As the day faded, the men returned one by one, heads bowed, heavy with fatigue. Janet stood on the porch waiting, her breath coming in visible puffs of white. No one spoke, no one needed to. In Carlson's logbook, the last line of the page was written in bold, "Missing, cause unknown." That night, as darkness settled again, the forest grew so still it was frightening, as though it was hiding something deep beneath its moss and fog. Janet switched off the porch light, slipped back inside, clutching the framed photo of David on the table, whispering to no one in the dark, "Where are you?" The first winter passed, and the Umatilla forest lay under a thin sheet of snow, blanketing the trails David used to walk. Janet kept her habit of standing at the window at dusk, staring out toward the trees, hoping for a glint of light, a footstep, a shadow returning. But the woods stayed quiet, as dark and still as the night he vanished. By the next month, police formally downgraded the case to missing, cause unknown, and the search party ceased. They assured Janet the file would remain open, that any new lead would be followed up. But she knew what they really meant. What was left now was only paperwork. When the deputies stopped coming, the neighbors slowly stopped too. At first they'd brought pies, kind words, even a little cash. But a few months later, the whispers began to ripple through Hermiston. That David Parker had run off to escape his debts. That he'd abandoned his family. Janet didn't answer. She no longer had the strength. The cabin grew colder. The kitchen stayed dark most nights. The porch light rarely burned. Long into the nights, Janet would sit, curled on her bed, clutching David's framed photo, her eyes raw, her hands trembling with each gust of wind whistling through the cracks in the doorframe. Bank notices kept piling up. The mortgage was overdue. Her son, Matt, just 20 at the time, made the choice to quit school, folding away the agricultural college application his father had once encouraged him to fill out. He aged years in a matter of months, his shoulders sagged, his hands blistered and calloused after seasons of fencing, feeding what little cattle were left, patching what could still be patched. He worked himself silent, a grim shadow of the boy he'd been. Some nights, Janet heard him slam his fist against the table, cursing his father under his breath, calling him a coward. But later, she'd catch him glancing at the photo on the mantel, his expression a mix of fury and grief. By late spring, when the forest turned green again, the Parker yard was still coated in a fine layer of dust, as though no one had swept it in months. One late evening, Janet stood on the porch, staring into the woods. The cold air drifted from the canopy, heavy with the smell of wet earth. She whispered his name, so softly it barely left her lips, then turned inside and closed the door. The forest stayed silent, and everything inside the house seemed to go silent with it. 4 years passed. By October 2017, autumn draped the Umatilla forest in pale gray, heavy fog clinging to the canopy like wool. Night rains had softened the ground, turning the trails into slick ribbons of mud. Overhead, flocks of crows circled the blackened pines, their calls harsh and hollow. One Tuesday afternoon, Melissa Ortiz, a ranger with Oregon State Forestry, left the district office early to squeeze in one last patrol before the forecasted storm rolled in. She was 35, weathered but composed, her sun-tanned face framed by tightly pulled hair. At her side trotted Duke, the Belgian Malinois she'd adopted from the state's retired K-9 program. Duke, who'd served 7 years on the missing persons team, was aging and slower now, but his amber eyes stayed sharp, his lean frame still sure-footed. He couldn't endure the long manhunts anymore, but short patrols suited him fine. That day, Ortiz took Duke down a seldom-used trail on the forest's northern edge, an area hunters sometimes trespassed. The light was already fading beneath the towering trees, shadows thickening over the mossy ground. She moved steadily, scanning for violations, snares, litter, hacked saplings. Duke padded ahead, nose low, ears half-cocked like always. 2 miles in a low clearing veiled in fog, Duke froze. His body stiffened, a guttural whine slipping from his throat. Ortiz stopped immediately, eyes narrowing on him. She called his name. He didn't respond. Instead, he crouched low, sniffing toward a shallow mound nestled between a cluster of old pines. And then he lunged off the trail. "Duke!" she barked, but he was already clawing through fallen leaves, digging furiously into the soft earth. Ortiz slogged after him, mud splattering her pants as branches snapped underfoot. Duke's barking rose, frantic and sharp, his claws tearing at dirt and sprays. The pitch of his voice something she'd never quite heard before, something unnerving. She dropped to one knee beside him. The air reeked of damp soil and rotting pine. The mound was low, grass uneven, the kind of disturbed patch only a trained eye or nose would notice. Ortiz reached out, took her baton, and began scraping away at the soil. Slowly, a stiff, dirt-clogged scrap of brown fabric emerged. She tugged gently. A heavy garment came loose, its seams still intact, though caked and stiff, buttons faintly gleaming. Next to it lay a cowboy hat, crushed and fraying, resting atop a small, brittle wooden cross, driven through a pair of bleached deer bones, crossed like some primitive offering. The entire arrangement lay in the shallow pit, neat and deliberate, clothing, cross, bones, hat, like some quiet, grotesque ritual left for someone to find. Ortiz stared for a long moment, her pulse hammering in her ears. Duke fell silent and stepped back, his hackles raised. She fumbled for her phone, her hands shaking, and dialed 911. Her voice was even but taut, catching on the words. "This is Ranger Ortiz, North Sector Patrol. I've located a shallow grave, clothing, bones, and what looks like a ritual marker. Send someone immediately." The dispatcher sounded skeptical, but assured her a unit would check the site. Ortiz stood there, gripping Duke's lead, eyes locked on the cold earth. The light was fading now. The last rays of sun slipped behind the trees. Wind hissed through the trunks as if the forest itself were issuing a warning. Word of Ortiz's discovery reached the Umatilla County Sheriff's Office within hours. The station was a flurry of movement. Veterans of countless cold cases felt the electricity in the air. After 4 years of silence, finally a lead, and one that was unsettling in ways none of them liked to admit. Detective Michael Hensley looked older now than he had on that first night at the Parker porch. His hair had gone nearly white, his back stooped, but his eyes still carried that cold, clinical sharpness of a man who'd seen too much. When the call came through, he left his coffee untouched, grabbed his coat, and muttered just one thing as he stepped out into the night. The woods finally decided to talk. The scene was cordoned off quickly. Spotlights flooded the clearing, cutting through drifting fog and glinting off the churned, muddy earth. Crime scene techs knelt in the muck, photographing and bagging each detail. The brown jacket, the crushed cowboy hat, the crude wooden cross driven through the pale deer bones. Each item sealed in plastic and tagged. Hensley stood back, hands deep in his pockets, eyes fixed on the collection. In the harsh light, he recognized the jacket and the hat immediately. He'd seen them for years on the faded photo that still hung above Janet Parker's mantel. A chill ran through him. That night, he drove himself to the Parker ranch. Janet met him on the porch, thinner and paler than before. She didn't ask anything, just looked at him with eyes that already knew. In the kitchen, he laid the photographs one by one on the table. The jacket, the hat, the cross and bones. Janet reached out with trembling fingers, her breath catching as she touched the images. She confirmed without hesitation. They're his. They're David's. And then she broke down, sobbing like a child. When she finally quieted, Hensley lowered his voice. "Janet, are you sure there's nothing else? Nothing you've kept from me these 4 years?" Janet shook her head, though something in her eyes flickered. Then she rose, wiped her cheeks, and went to an old cabinet in the corner. After rummaging a moment, she returned with a stack of faded papers and set them on the table. "You should see these. I kept them. They were receipts, payments made in cash, each one for a few hundred to a few $1,000s, scattered over 8 months before David vanished. All processed through wire counters in Hermiston, Pendleton, even as far as Yakima. No clear notation, just scribbled words. Equipment, advance, cattle. Hensley leafed through them, his brow furrowing. This was classic dirty money. Off books, unreported. He looked at Janet, his voice hoarse. Did you ever know who he was taking money from? Janet hesitated. No, he never said. Just told me it would save the ranch. In his mind, the pieces began to fit. Crushing debt, unmarked cash, and now a bizarre shallow grave with a ritual cross. The next day, Hensley called an old contact, Luis Suarez, a DEA agent who'd worked the border. When Hensley described the scene, Suarez fell silent for a long time before finally speaking. You know, they have ways of sending messages. Across through deer bones, hat downturned, that's Sinaloa's style. It means the prey's been hunted. And snitches die. Suarez warned him plainly, if this really was the work of the Mexican cartel, it wasn't just a murder anymore. It was a statement. That evening, Hensley sat in his office, staring at the photo of the crude cross driven through the earth. His eyes darkened. He knew now he wasn't just chasing a killer. He was staring into the machinery of something much bigger. Something brutal that had crept quietly into Oregon's woods. Outside, the wind hissed through the pines, carrying the damp smell of earth. The forest held its silence. But this time, he decided, he would make it talk. For weeks after the discovery in the woods, Detective Hensley threw himself into the case file. He stayed up nights combing through bank statements, stacks of cash receipts, old interview transcripts. The biggest piece of the puzzle now lay on his desk, the cartel. And he needed proof they had really touched David Parker. It was Suarez, the DEA agent, who opened the last door. He arranged to meet Hensley in an interrogation room at the federal penitentiary in Walla Walla, Washington. The man they needed to see was Hector Morales. He'd been a mid-level link in Sinaloa's Northwest operations, picked up 3 years earlier for interstate trafficking. Suarez swore he knew more than he'd ever admitted. And now he was ready to cooperate in exchange for a lighter sentence and transfer. Hensley entered the dim room. Morales was slouched, gaunt, his tattooed neck glistening with sweat, hollow eyes watching Hensley with a crooked smile. So, Morales sneered, you finally want to hear the real story? Hensley didn't answer. He sat, started the recorder. Morales cleared his throat and began. According to him, David Parker was no coward who ran. He was a desperate man. When the bank came calling, Parker was cornered. A middleman approached him with an offer that sounded simple. Let the cartel use a corner of his barn deep in the woods to stash shipments, and he'd get regular cash, enough to save his land. At first it worked. Money came in, the bank backed off. Janet never knew, just assumed he'd been selling off a few head of cattle off the books. But then Sinaloa wanted more. Morales's voice stayed flat as he explained. He was just a farmer guarding trees. But to us, he was guarding a road. And then we didn't just need drugs moved. We needed people. Women, kids. Stashed on his land, David refused. He'd raised his voice. Even threatened to go to the police. Morales smirked. With us, you don't have to talk. You just have to think about it. That's enough. One night, Morales said, 2 of his guys waited for David on the trail as he checked the fence. They clamped his arms, gagged him, dragged him into a truck. They took him to an abandoned cabin 30 miles over the county line. For 3 days he was tied to a chair, beaten, tortured, forced to sign over his deed to a cartel shell company. But he wouldn't. He clenched his jaw, shook his head, even as his nails ripped, ribs cracked, blood pooled on the floorboards. On the final night, Morales said, El Martillo, the cell's leader in Oregon, came himself. Tall, dressed in black, eyes cold as steel. He leaned close to David and whispered, "You can keep your forest, but you won't keep your life." At dawn, they took him away. Morales didn't know what they did with the body. They never left bodies. But before leaving, Morales himself had been ordered to bury the clothes with a message. He carved a crude cross out of deadwood, wedged deer bones through it, and laid David's crushed cowboy hat on top. He remembered it clearly, because that's how you remind the others. The prey has been hunted, and the one who talks dies. When he finished, Morales let out a dry laugh, a hollow sound echoing through the room. He leaned back, spit on the floor. And now, I've talked. Better watch your backs for me. Hensley didn't respond. He shut off the recorder, stood, his eyes burning. In his mind, the picture was finally whole. David Parker hadn't run. He hadn't been weak. He stood up to evil, and paid with his life. That night, leaving the prison, Hensley drove through the Black Mountains, headlights cutting the dark. Pines rose tall on either side. He caught himself whispering to no one, so quiet it was barely audible. You died, but you didn't break. The forest outside stayed silent. But this time, in the dark, Hensley felt David Parker had finally spoken. Just a week after Morales' confession, the gates of hell opened. The taped interview was sent immediately to the DEA office in Portland. A late-night emergency meeting was called, with agents from the FBI, ATF, and federal prosecutors from Seattle gathered around a long conference table. Their faces were tense as they studied the thick file bearing the cold heading, Parker Homicide, Sinaloa Link Suspected. Luis Suarez laid it out flatly. The locations Morales had named matched with several suspected sites already under quiet surveillance. A cold storage facility in Pendleton, an abandoned lumber yard in Milton Freewater, and a run-down auto shop on 11th Street. He spoke without emotion. These aren't corner dealers. This is a Sinaloa cell. It runs like a business. And Parker was just in their way. By the time the night ended, the operation already had a name, Timberfall. In early November, a coordinated sweep went down across Umatilla County. Helicopter spotlights sliced through the fog, lighting up rotting roofs and skeletal barns. Federal agents in black vests and rifles kicked down doors, their voices barking, "Down! Federal agents!" into the quiet streets. Within 24 hours, 6 members of the cell were in custody. At the cold storage site, they seized 4 bricks of heroin, nearly $100,000 in cash, and a file of forged property deeds, including one in Parker's name that had never been completed. Hensley stood by his car the whole time, watching silently as it unfolded, his eyes on every suspect hauled out in cuffs. During an interrogation, one gaunt man finally admitted under pressure, "I didn't kill him. I just took orders." The orders came from El Martillo. He's gone now. El Martillo. The name surfaced at last. Luis Suarez confirmed it, the internal nickname of the Oregon cell leader, a brutal enforcer sent up from Sonora. But he'd vanished just days after Parker disappeared, slipping back into the larger Sinaloa network in Mexico, beyond the reach of American courts. Prosecutors worked hard to build a murder case against the captured men. But without a body, without a direct witness, it all hinged on Morales and circumstantial evidence. In the end, 4 of the 6 pled guilty to trafficking, money laundering, conspiracy, but no one was convicted of David Parker's death. On sentencing day, Janet and Matt Parker sat quietly in the back of the Portland federal courtroom. Janet sat straight-backed, hands tightly clasped, her eyes cold and clear. Matt stared at the shackled men, his jaw so tight his lip bled. When the judge read the decades-long sentences, Janet didn't cry. But as she glimpsed the photograph of David displayed on the evidence table, she lowered her head and whispered, "They can't break him anymore." That evening, Hensley drove the Parkers back to the ranch himself. The 3 of them stood together at the fence, staring into the dark, endless line of trees. The wind whispered through the pines like a warning. No one spoke, but they all knew. The men who had actually killed David Parker were still free. But the organization was broken, the pipeline severed, and that was the only justice they were going to get in a war this dirty. Hensley turned to leave, his hand gripping the steering wheel. Under his breath, just for himself, he murmured, "The forest owes him a reckoning." Behind him, Umatilla stood silent. The wind still blew. The trees stood tall, as if they'd seen nothing at all. That winter came early, colder than any in memory. The Umatilla forest lay under layers of frost, snow piling heavy on the roads that led to the Parker Ranch. The old wooden house stood silent, its gray roof sagging, the faint yellow glow of its porch light flickering like a weak flame against the long black night. Inside, Janet sat by the cold hearth, her hands clasped tight around a cup of tea gone cold. She looked decades older now than she had 4 years ago. Her hair hung white and thin, her face hollow, her eyes sunken and empty. Matt, now fully a man, was lean and hard, his silence deepened, his calloused hands so numb to the frost they barely felt it anymore. In the months after Operation Timberfall, the bills kept coming. The bank didn't care what the Parkers had endured, only what was owed. Janet had sold the last of their cattle in March, the old machinery in April. It was barely enough to keep the house standing a few more months. Matt tried to hold on, picking up odd jobs at neighboring ranches, working nights repairing fences and chopping wood to sell. But when spring came, Janet quietly called a realtor from Pendleton and asked her to list what little remained of the land. The contract was signed on May 7th. That day, Janet wore her black coat and sat by the window, watching as surveyors drove stakes into the ground and stretched white nylon lines, dividing up what had been their home. Matt stood on the porch, his hand gripping the rail, his gaze dark. When the realtor's car pulled away, Janet stepped out onto the porch. She stared into the forest, the same forest that had once sheltered David, then swallowed him, then returned only a cruel token of him. She said nothing, just untwined her scarf, squeezing it tight in her fist before letting it fall. Matt caught it and looked up at her, something in his eyes both pained and proud. "He wasn't a coward," Matt said quietly, but firmly. Janet nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. On the day they left the ranch, Janet walked slowly, glancing back at every fence post, every warped beam of wood, every cracked window. She stopped at the porch, where she'd stood 4 years ago, watching David disappear into the trees. She laid her hand on the cold doorframe. That night, they slept in a small apartment in town. For the first time in years, Janet finally closed her eyes and rested. In her dream, she saw David standing among the pines, tall and calm, his eyes filled with quiet pride. He smiled at her, and for the first time she smiled back. The Umatilla forest remained still, blanketed in snow as though nothing had ever happened. But for the Parkers, it would always be the place that held both a shattered legacy and the quiet pride of a man who died standing tall. 3 years after leaving the ranch, Janet Parker returned to Umatilla for the first time. It was an autumn morning, the trail into the forest strewn with gold leaves, the mist hanging thick like memory. She carried a bundle of white flowers in a worn cloth basket and a small granite headstone bearing her husband's name. Matt walked a step behind her, broader now, his eyes steady, his stride firm and sure, just like his father's. Together, they stopped at the edge of the woods, at the very spot where the ranger had found that shallow grave years ago. Janet knelt, laying the white flowers gently on the cold earth, then set the stone in place. Its inscription was simple: David L. Parker, 1955 to 2013. He never bowed. Her hands trembled, but a faint smile touched her lips. Deep down, she realized she no longer needed to cry. Across the country, the DEA had long since published its final report on Operation Timberfall. It detailed how a Sinaloa cell had been dismantled, how its trafficking routes had been severed, how dozens of men were in prison. But buried deep in the hundreds of pages, David Parker's name appeared only once, in a quiet footnote marked "Likely Victim." Case unresolved. No one among the arrested ever admitted to striking the fatal blow. No body was ever found. El Martillo had vanished without a trace. Legally, David Parker's case remained an open question. Online, the story of the Forest Cross spread like a dark folktale. People whispered, speculated, embellished it in forums about unsolved crimes. Some blamed Parker, calling him a fool who played with fire. Others praised him as a man who refused to bow to evil. Janet didn't care. She stood, brushed the dirt from her hands, and took one step back, gazing deep into the trees. The wind breathed down through the canopy, slipping past her cheek like a whisper. "Thank you." Matt placed a hand on her shoulder, bowed his head to the stone, and murmured, soft enough for only the two of them to hear. "You kept your word." Janet nodded, a fleeting pride shining in her eyes, and as they turned to leave, she glanced back one last time. The forest stood, dark and endless and silent, but this time it didn't feel so frightening, because now she knew the forest had spoken, and David Parker was still here.